America is mostly a free market economy, but economies never move in isolation. Policy always shapes it. In this episode, we'll dig into this idea a bit, focusing on two recent US DOT initiatives that have been making a lot of waves recently: stepped up enforcement on English language proficiency requirements, and the new interim final rule on non-domiciled CDLs. To help us understand how these changes could ripple through capacity rates and freight supply, we're joined by friend and colleague Avery Vise, Vice President of Trucking at FTR Transportation Intelligence. Avery paints a measured picture of a market that is performing better, or at least less negative than most of 2024, while pointing out the possible impacts of policy shifts in the long run. So, welcome to TrueNorth Truck Thought. Join us as we unpack what's ahead for trucking's economic outlook. Well, hello and welcome everyone to this good and important podcast. Going to talk a little bit about the economy and capacity, and of course those lovely and interesting recent final rules on non-domicile and English language proficiency. So happy to invite back, as always, Bert and Steve, but most importantly, we have Avery Vise with us today from FTR. Thank you for being here, Avery. If you wouldn't mind, take a minute or so and just introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Sean. Hello, everyone. So Avery Vise, I am Vice President of Trucking for FTR Transportation Intelligence. Vice President of Trucking just means I'm sort of the chief analyst. Been with FTR for almost 8 years now. We do freight analysis and forecasting in trucking, rail, and intermodal. We also forecast demand and production of trucks and trailers, as well as rail cars. Been in the industry more than a quarter century. For quite a while, I was the chief editor of Commercial Carrier Journal, but I've been doing sort of what I'm doing now for the last 12 to 15 years, market analysis and forecasting and so on.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate that. Quarter century sure does make it sound like a long time. I haven't known you that long, but I know I've known you for a while. So really appreciate you being on with us today.
Yeah, and I was lowballing that, unfortunately.
Well, thanks, Avery. We really appreciate it. And we're going to ask you to look into your crystal ball a little bit today. It's on everyone's mind, I think, and this podcast is timely. And to Sean's point, let's just jump right in. I mean, there's been a number of things on the front minds of folks lately, particularly a lot of actions at the DOT and FMCSA that I think have an impact on the situation, and we want to talk through that a little bit. So maybe the first thing, I think, let's talk English language proficiency. Change over the summer with enforcement and out of service. What capacity effects are you seeing or are you expecting to see as enforcement continues to get ramped up here, especially among, immigrant or cross-border drivers? What are your thoughts there?
So, if we're going to talk about just the English language, in isolation, because obviously there's a broader issue here. Yeah. But let's just talk about the ELP enforcement. It's certainly significant in terms of, total numbers. If you look at where we are, where we were, say, in September of 2025, that level, if we do a run rate on that, which is more or less the highest we've been during this brief period, puts us at about 25,000 unique drivers being placed out of service. We are seeing some number of drivers being placed out of service more than once. We're seeing a lot more just total violations more than once, but not necessarily out of service violations. So what does 25,000 mean? Well, if we look at the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, that is, at least in theory, taking out roughly 35,000 drivers a year. That does not seem to have really affected the market, in any sense. And, again, I need to make sure everybody understands. I'm looking at this strictly from a market issue. I'm not looking at the safety implications, which obviously, completely different discussion. But, if we look at 25,000, that's not going to be enough to really make a significant impact in the market. We generally, as a rule of thumb, look at 2 to 3% of a capacity impact to have a meaningful impact. We have something on the order of 3.5 million active Class 8 drivers out there. So 25,000 is just not really a needle mover. Maybe it has other effects, but that alone is not going to move the needle. One other point there too is that these are not, at least in the initial phases, these are not all, CDL over the road drivers. We're seeing a whole bunch of these operations. Now, it's probably a fairly small number of them, but a whole bunch of them are weird. I haven't quite figured out exactly what they're doing. You guys may know more than I. But there was the number one motor carrier violator, which has been put out of service for, at this point, almost 2 months, still has the most number of drivers with an out of service violation, reported as a one truck operation that operates essentially just Ford F-350s and Ram 3500s. And there's multiple operations like that. My point is that we're taking out this number of drivers, but some number of them really are not contributing to the freight environment to begin with. So if we just isolate ELP, we really don't think ELP has been or even will be in isolation a game changer.
Yeah, so interesting. Sorry, Steve, I hadn't thought about the CDL, non-CDL sort of situation or the freight impact there. 25,000 is not a big number to Avery Vise, who looks at a lot of big numbers. What about 200,000? Does that feel like a big number? Now we're talking about non-domiciled CDL.
I was going to say, you didn't just pull that number out of the
I kind of.
Obviously, even before the announcement, which all came together pretty quickly, I'm sure you guys had knew it was coming before the average person, but I had written about in our September report, which was published almost a full month before the rule, the emergency interim final rule came out, that based on that August 12th crash in Florida that got so much notoriety and caused a lot of changes, including a pause on work visas and so on. I sort of speculated that if the outcome of that audit that was required by the April 28th executive order from President Trump was to, end or severely restrict the whole non-domiciled CDL program, which I at that point I was like, that's kind of extreme. But if it happened, it could be a market mover.
I don't know it's extreme anymore.
Right. That could be a market mover. And I emphasize the word could because there's still a lot of, there are a lot of questions there. Are we talking about, only Class A? Are we talking about, as we know, the immigrant population tends to be drawn to construction. So how many of those drivers are operating dump trucks? How many, so there's a lot of questions that we do not have real answers to. We also know, only from FMCSA that they're expecting this impact over a period of 2 years. How is that going to play out sequentially and linearly? Is it, we would imagine there's going to be some degree of front loading because if you have a non-domiciled CDL and that you're not going to be able to renew it, you might just move on, right? So we are expecting some level. However, we tend to be at FTR, we're very much data driven. And the data that we have is still sort of, squishy, especially in terms of what the market impact will be. Now, this is very early. It's maybe not quite as early on the ELP issue, which, essentially has been around since late June. But, until we start to see some indication that this is actually moving the market, we're really not going to over forecast. So we are going to be publishing in our, next report. We update our forecast on a monthly basis. We are going to be publishing a higher number for what we call active truck utilization, which is essentially our way of just talking about the tightness of the market. It's really just a measure. It's a barometer of how tight the market is. And we are going to project that the non-domiciled CDL issue and the ELP issue combined will have, essentially a modest impact, less than 1% change at its max. And that's probably going to build over time.
Reduction in capacity, is that what you're talking about? Due
strictly to a reduction in capacity, and the follow-on effects on, okay, there's the same amount of freight, there's less capacity, so obviously there's more utilization for existing capacity. It's a pretty much, now we published in our September report our October report, an analysis of where, depending on what you think, how that could play out. And we had sort of a maximum impact. I might have shared that with you previously, Sean, I can't recall, but our maximum impact would be, let's assume all 194,000 drivers are over-the-road drivers. They're all actively engaged. They're very much part of the U.S. transportation system. Let's also assume that anybody we lose because of ELP, is separate from that, which of course seems pretty unlikely. It seems like there would be quite a bit of overlap there. But let's just assume, for argument's sake, you assume all those things, it's a very different picture. You assume all those things, we get to a 2021 type environment without any improvement in freight by the end of next year. That's a big change in the market. And that is it is a plausible scenario. It is one we're not, discounting as possible. We just don't think, until we see any evidence that the spot market is tightening or that anything is really changing from a market perspective other than anecdotal reports, right? People talk about what happened in Oklahoma. People talk about a lot of anecdotal stuff. We take that into account. We listen. We mull over it. But we're very data driven. So if we start seeing a change in the market, really due to spot rates, that's really going to be what is going to be kind of our signal. That maybe we'll start like, okay, maybe we'll up this a little bit. But we tend to start low and kind of build from there, and that's kind of where we are now.
It's interesting because I think that 200,000 number, to your point, we don't know where that number comes from, right? And whether or not how accurate it is. Another topic that has been swirling around this issue is cabotage, right? And cabotage being a problem. Again, we don't have a whole lot of data sources that are reliable where we understand that.
Really?
Right. So I think your point, is we don't know how this is going to play out. I can see some of these drivers shifting to non-CDL operations, right? Moving to smaller vehicles potentially, right? So they'll stay in the market, but not trying to fly under the radar. That could potentially happen.
Sure. And now from our perspective, if they leave essentially the Class 8 environment and go to something else, it still is a net loss of capacity to us, because the fact that they might still be truck drivers is sort of beside the point. If they're not driving a Class 8 truck, it's a loss of capacity. The cabotage one is interesting because, that's even harder to get a handle on because that's a commercial enforcement that currently isn't being done. I know some states, I think Arkansas has sort of has gone down that road to make that part of the process, in a roadside inspection. But it's it's again, one of those things where the anecdotal discussion is overwhelming, right? If you go to a cocktail reception, at the ATA MC&E or something, you'll come away with, oh my God, this is going to be the biggest thing forever. But it's all still anecdotal, and more to the point, even if it's not anecdotal, remember this is an enormous industry. This would have to be a really big problem to move the needle. Now we are completely of the mind that this could be a really big problem. But we're not prepared at this point to start, forecasting a big upturn in the market based on something we don't know is happening. And again, because, roadside inspection personnel is already strained and this is not their focus, we just think that the whole cabotage thing is going to be more of a indirect, right? It's not going to come out of direct enforcement. It's probably going to come out of the ELP enforcement and maybe not so much the non-domiciled CDL because theoretically these are Mexican and Canadian drivers, right? These are not, if we're talking about cabotage. So the non-domiciled CDL theoretically is irrelevant. So it'll come from ELP enforcement, which again, at this point is not taking out enough drivers to make a difference.
Now, we've been talking about kind of the existing driver market, with all this pressure that DOT is pushing on the states with this IFR and restricting the issuance of new non-domiciled CDLs. Do you see that impacting on capacity very much? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, that is part of our overall forecast that I was talking about earlier, where we do think that this is going to matter, but it's not. We're taking a kind of a wait and see over what degree it's going to matter. So, we have a forecast that starts to tighten early next year, but even by the end of next year, which is kind of where we see this sort of peaking out, we're only at about a percentage point more utilization than where we would have been before. And that's not a whole lot. So even in our, current estimate, which again is kind of conservative, we don't end up with this being an enormous deal. There are all sorts of, again, unknowns, questions, potential workarounds. I think we've all been around the industry long enough to know, and I think this was a discussion everybody had 7 years ago during the whole ELD issue. Is there are ways around some of this stuff, and of course we're learning. We've been learning about one way around it is to just have an ELD that doesn't actually work, right? It doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. So not a month goes by that FMCSA is not shutting down multiple ELDs. But my point is that drivers, for good or ill, and in a lot of cases, we want drivers to be resourceful. We want drivers to be creative, right? Within reason. But that sort of mindset also leads to, they find ways to make things happen that, maybe we didn't anticipate. One of the things people are talking about is how many of these maybe are going to Mexico and Canada to get, some type of immigration status,
sure, yeah.
And then coming in as Mexican drivers or Canadian drivers, even though they really aren't. So I guess my fundamental point here is that enforcement tends to not be a market mover unless it is a very, very large pool, like an ELD, like in hours of service, where you have essentially everybody affected by it, not a discrete group. Now, this is a very large discrete group, but it is a limited group. And then we're layering on top of that the idea that, we don't have ubiquitous enforcement. This isn't like I remember when FMCSA rolled out the concept of a wireless inspection back in, this would have been in the 2000s. One of their concepts was essentially that this would all be linked to telematics and that everybody would be, inspected continuously 24/7, right? We don't have that, right? So you have the fact that this is only a piece of the population, and then layered on top of that, the fact that we don't have the level of enforcement that would be needed to do this, and nor do we necessarily want it. I mean, can you imagine what trucking companies would say if we were pulling over every single truck to see if they had all the papers they needed?
Seriously,
that would not go well.
So, we talked about there is potentially some modest impact on capacity, right? And so I guess I have my question is, everything I've been reading shows that we're sort of I'm going to ask two questions at once. So here we go. Shows that we're over capacity, right? So that's one of the problems in the market. So ignoring sort of the human aspect of this, is the modest decrease in capacity good for the market, good for the industry in that way? And then my second question is, when I first saw the ELP thing come out, I thought, this is not about safety. This thing is not about safety. It feels more like it's about the driver market and driver wages. And so just wondering what you think maybe the ELP and non-domicile, how that might impact driver wages,
sure,
or rates over time.
Well, it is only going to impact driver wages and rates to the extent that it does have a capacity correcting, effect. And, when we bring in the cabotage issue, which, we may learn someday that cabotage was the big issue all along, right? Well, that makes things even murkier because we're not necessarily talking about, an easily defined impact, right? Because it's a follow-on impact. Because we're not, you could reduce cabotage without even taking any drivers out of the market, right? You could just basically force them to kind of work around it. So, it all kind of goes back to our utilization. If utilization gets stronger, then there will be some impact on rates and wages. At this point, our conservative approach is quite modest. It's really not going to have a huge impact, but that is in the near term. And I think a lot of people are thinking of this as a much longer issue, right? I mean, we will have, remember, all of what I'm talking about assumes a freight forecast that we currently have that is pretty sluggish still, right? Our freight forecast doesn't even really start to go stronger until the middle of next year. But, there will be another strong market again. And when we have that strong market, that market is going to be, X percentage stronger because of what's going on now. So you could look at this as not so much as, okay, this is, so maybe some people are hoping that this will have an immediate effect on the market. We're extraordinarily skeptical of that. But what we are less skeptical about is the idea that a year from now, 18 months from now, 2 years from now, what's going on now will put the industry in a position that it will be much tighter than it would have been otherwise. I mean, you could even conceive of if this were successful, to the extent that this is more of a capacity play than a safety play, that that people will regret this, that some people will regret having done this. Now, probably not, because let's face it. I mean, for hire trucking companies, as much as they will complain in 2021 or 2018 about the driver shortage, they live for the driver shortage, right? They want the driver shortage. They have to have the driver shortage. So So I always sort of dismiss those complaints. I'm like, well, this is exactly what you wanted, so don't complain. But
well, you go back. I mean, you think about that, Avery. That's when we saw these large populations from a lot of these countries coming in.
Yeah, that's true.
Was back in. I could see that now. We go through all these hurdles today. It tightens up, and then everything it loosens back up. I mean, is that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we still have not gotten rid of cycles. The issue we're having now, let's just kind of talk more broadly than just the foreign driver issue. But the issue we have now is we had all this extraordinary pressure to increase the population of drivers in 2020, starting in late 2020 and going into 2022. And in fact, if you look at payroll employment and trucking, the second quarter of 2022 is almost unbelievable, right? You had, mainly because of the surge in diesel prices, because of the Russia invasion of Ukraine, you had a whole bunch of one truck operations that thought, well, maybe this is not my cup of tea. Maybe I ought to drive for a trucking company. My point is that you had this buildup of capacity, and what would normally have happened is a lot of those small guys would have gone away, and you just would have had a shift back to the larger carriers. And what happened is, yes, a large number of them did go away, but we still have a bunch of them still in the market.
How? That's one of my questions. How are they still in the market? It's been 3 years of a terrible freight recession.
So one issue may very well be the drivers who are operating on non-domiciled CDLs. So we might have that issue. We had not focused on that issue, to be honest. We were focusing on all the other issues, which if you think through all of the possibilities here, it kind of makes some sense. First of all, let's start with the most basic, the things that don't really change from market to market. A lot of these, one truck operations, number one, they have no overhead, right? They have a truck and they have themselves. In a lot of cases, they have a spouse who has a job, who has benefits. So their ability to take a lower rate and survive right off the top is stronger. Now, in other markets, we've still seen a lot of them go away. But we also have the fact that, how many of them paid off their truck or paid off their debts in 2021 when they were making more money than they've ever seen before. So you start off with these balance sheets that are just amazing. You also have, the rise of what's called the digital freight platforms, or, however you want to describe the concept. But the bottom line is that in large part because of the ELD rule, where, you had all these one truck operations who said, I will never go off paper. I will quit the industry before you put me on an ELD, who, suddenly found, well, it's not really that big of a deal, or,
they found ELDs that look a lot more like paper,
well, there is that issue too. And that is that's one that's harder for us to quantify, because in order to quantify that, we would have to essentially audit every ELD and figure out, what percentage out there. But we are kind of assuming that there's got to be some significant level of non-compliance, because the ELDs just haven't been taken out of the market yet. But we're not counting on it. We're not building that into our argument. But what we are taking into account is that there's a lot more visibility between the small operation and brokers than there ever was. And, it was interesting. Actually, as you know, has an annual report on operating costs. And the one that came out not this year, but the one that came out last year had an interesting point that in some ways makes perfect sense, in some ways seems counterintuitive. And it is that the smallest fleets had a smaller empty mile percentage than the larger fleets. Now, on one hand, you think, well, that doesn't make sense because the larger fleets are so good at technology, blah, blah, blah. But
the larger fleets can take any freight they want, right?
The smaller fleets can go anywhere, right? So that is one issue. And I think what one factor, and it's not an insignificant factor, is that this greater visibility and this greater connectivity between small fleets, and we're really talking mostly 1-2 truck operations when I say small fleet, and brokers, has allowed a lot of these small operations to substitute the lack of rate growth with getting in an extra load per week, or getting an extra, couple of loads per week, which of course it becomes a little bit of a vicious circle, right? Their increased productivity has kept rates lower. And so that has, had an effect on the broader market, but it hasn't really necessarily hurt them as much. And then diesel prices, of course, have been relatively attractive. They're not at all-time lows, certainly, but they're in the scheme of where we've been since the beginning of the 2010s. They're fairly attractive. So you have a lot of factors that all kind of come into play, and one that we haven't really tracked systematically, but we certainly hear it over and over and over, which is, no truck lender wants their truck back. Right. So they're allowing a lot of these operations to make lower payments or make occasional payments or so on, because they don't want their truck back. And we haven't seen any indication that is really fundamentally changing. The big question really is going to be, a lot of those trucks were bought in 2021, 2022. They were bought used. A lot of these operations are going to start going out of business just because they can't afford to replace their truck. That's hard to track. That's very difficult to track. Yeah.
Well, and that's, I guess, one other point I wanted, because I know you track new registrations as well with carriers, and in COVID, when rates went through the roof, we saw a huge influx, and with a lot of this pressure now, and most of them or one truck operators, right? And it aligns with kind of your thinking on kind of how they're staying afloat, if you will. But do you see kind of this focus now on enforcement depressing more carriers wanting to enter the market? Do you see a capacity issue there that could have an impact there?
Well, it's interesting. It gets complicated because there's a psychological element that is kind of hard to get past. For one thing, we think that a lot of carriers who probably should have gone out of business a year ago were expecting an upturn, and they stick it out. If you think about it from their perspective, you've suffered through this. You're getting by. You're not making money. You're probably you're hurting, but you think that we might be a quarter or two away from an upturn. Well, why would I get out now, right? And so here's where the non-domiciled ELP issue comes in. And I think it works two ways simultaneously. One is, I'm sure a bunch of these, new entrants are drivers who are, can't pass the test and don't have or have non-domiciled CDLs. So you would expect, yes, there would be a depressive impact. But you also have this media attention about how this is going to really crash capacity. And guess what? That encourages other operations to get into the market and get ahead of it. Because for one thing, one thing that sort of came out of the fraud issue that we've been seeing and some other things is that brokers are getting, tighter on wanting these operations to have some longevity. So, one of the best practices is, get in early, get yourself some experience so that you can age into some of this freight. So, I think there is some perspective impact there. It was interesting. We saw in the middle part of it saw in the springtime mainly an uptick in new entry, and it was maybe some degree because of rates, but I think it was mainly volume. We had a lot more volume. Some of it was, pulled forward because of tariffs. And so we did see that go up. It's come down a little bit, and we'll be, I guess, a little over a week from now, we'll be looking at the October data. But, it is still looking very stable. I look at the notices of revocations, for example, on the other side of the ledger, and not really seeing a lot of change. We sort of thought because the producer price index for commercial auto insurance premiums was soaring, that would take, that would cut into new entrants and maybe lead to some revocations, isn't really showing up in the data. So part of the issue, I think, is that we have culled from the industry the weakest players at this point. So if you're still around, you probably know to some degree what you're doing, and so I think that's part of the issue is that, things aren't getting worse. So if you can survive, if you've survived it to this point, odds are you're going to survive for a while longer, barring your truck breaking down and you can't afford to replace it, which I think is probably going to, at this point, the most likely thing that's going to take an operation out of the market other than the non-domiciled CDL issue.
Or you're getting a bad crash.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. Losing your truck one way or the other is going to do it. Yeah.
You mentioned tariffs, and I was listening to a podcast this morning about the stock market, how that continues to soar. And, the S&P 500 is breaking records all the time. But I was just texting some friends yesterday asking, hey, are you going to MC&E? I'm going to be there. Can we catch up? And they're responding back with things like, hey, we're trying to keep the lights on here. Like we can't be doing any extra travel. I went to ATA's Safety Management Council. They were down like 40%, in attendance. And so obviously our market doesn't seem to track with the stock market. So question one, why is that? And question two, like, when I talk to some other economists, a lot of them point to the tariffs as a big pain point. And so just wanting to know, is it really the tariff rate or is it the nervousness about not knowing where the tariff is? Like, how does all that play? And three other questions I haven't combined into that one ridiculous.
Fair enough. Question. Well, to be honest, if I truly understood the dynamics of the equities markets, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I would be day trading. So, but I think there is a huge, and there's often a disconnect. I mean, if you tried to match up the Dow Jones Industrial Average to any economic indicator, you're going to be very disappointed. A lot of it is based on what they think is going to happen to the bond market, and that has a lot to do with interest rates and things like that. And they love they love it when the Fed lowers rates because that reduces the reason for anybody to put money in the bond market as opposed to putting it in the stock market, right? So that my point on the stock market is the stock market is not the economy, and just put that aside and ignore it. The question on tariffs, and that's just it. I mean, we don't see an upside in the near term to tariffs. Yes, there is the argument that this is going to drive domestic production. If it does drive domestic manufacturing, that is an enormous benefit for trucking, because that is what drives trucking, more so even than consumer spending. Now, depending on what you do as a carrier, you might be, much more tied to the retail sector than you are manufacturing. But manufacturing, as on a whole, drives a lot more trucking activity than consumer spending.
But Avery, you've been in that world. That's years to ramp up. Exactly. We just don't have idle factories sitting around waiting to be started
exactly.
up, right?
I mean, you get some announcements, and the administration certainly is trumpeting those announcements. But in a lot of cases, for one thing, there were things they were going to do anyway, and they just, taking advantage of the situation to announce them. But also, these are things that are going to be phased in over time. So, if we assume that the outcome is going to be even what the Trump administration assumes it will be, we're talking about something that we might not even notice for another 3 to 5 years or longer. So in the near term, it's hard to see an upside. It's hard to see how increasing the cost of production, how increasing the costs on consumers is going to lead to to things going up. And so, we have our own annual conference. Sean, you spoke there last year, in fact. And we had the same conversations with our own speakers and potential attendees that you had on MC&E, which is, we just imposed a travel ban, on our personnel. And although I think this would be worthwhile, I can't do it as a leader. I can't travel to this. And so, yes, there is this disconnect between what's happening in the market. Now, as I said earlier, the market is not worsening. So, and if you want to take that as good news, I guess,
I keep hearing that it's not getting worse.
You're not saying
worse. It's getting better.
And I think that's the problem. I used this analogy a couple of years ago. I'm not sure it applies anymore. I'm pretty sure I felt that it did a couple of years ago. And that is a game of chicken between small carriers and large carriers, because I feel that back in 2023, when we thought, oh God, this is horrible, and thank goodness it's going to turn around in 6 months, right? But a lot of the thinking for carriers who were competing against brokers using small one truck operations, who were undercutting rates and so on, is they just had to outlast them, right? We just hunker down, we cut costs, and they're going to go away. I think at this point, if you're thinking you can just outlast the market, you're mistaken. Now, where things come in, we're back to the main topic of our conversation, which is ELP and non-domiciled CDL. It's a disruptive thing, because you can actually argue, and I think you'd be plausibly correct, that it's almost a fault. I wouldn't say a false hope. Because that would imply that we don't think it's a big deal, and I think the jury is still out. But it is a hope that might yield people to make decisions that they possibly shouldn't make, because they're hoping for a rebound because of this loss of capacity. Maybe they should be looking at a exit strategy rather than getting ready to beef up their operation to take advantage of it. Now, we are not management consultants. We're not, we don't ever go to an individual, market player and tell them, here's what you should do. We just tell them what we think is, likely going to happen. But there is an argument to be made that the belief that this is going to be a huge deal, especially, if it does not in fact play out to be a huge deal, is actually potentially making things a little worse, because it is potentially forestalling a correction that should happen. And the correction is really, though, at the small end of the market. I mean, I really think that the significant truckload carriers out there have really done, for the most part, all they can do. Because, if you look at payroll employment and truckload, even based on the currently published data, we're back to pre-pandemic levels. if you look at the preliminary data that was put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in September, we're actually probably 2% or more below pre-pandemic levels in capacity. And, if you're a truckload carrier, you've got a couple of things you have to worry about. One of them is overhead that is completely necessary and you can't get rid of. And you need a certain amount of revenue volume to do that. You can't, cut down to one truck, you could increase your rate, but you only have one truck, right? And I think that's part of the problem is that in order for capacity to correct, it's got to come from this, population. I mean, we estimate roughly 88,000, carriers in the market that were not in the market pre-pandemic. That's about a 35% delta. How many?
Well, you had issued a report that said that large carriers, they have done the capacity.
Right, exactly.
Necessary.
I really think that most of the large carriers can't really cut themselves down to profitability, or more profitability at this point. They've gotten really kind of as tight, I think, as they can justify. And the problem is they can't control the other side. And, back to your question about is all of this a capacity play in a rate play as opposed to a safety play? We don't follow safety. And so I'm not going to state an FTR position on that. But I think it's fair to say that those who were behind this early on, I think were driven primarily by the notion that this is going to cut capacity and is going to be something that's going to change the market. And it may very well, and even at a minimum, it's going to make some impact, we think, on the market. It's just at this point,
and it's interesting when
it's a market changing impact.
Tying it together, just my very, very informal phone call, asked questions of these large carriers. ELP is a non-issue to them. Sure. It's not going to impact them at all. I mean, they corrected that years ago. Right. So they're the ones that stand to gain the most on the capacity.
Exactly,
obviously.
And I think that's why we're in the position with that we are, is because the dominant players in the market, at least from a voice standpoint, they had nothing to lose from this, right? It was only upside. So even if this doesn't play out that way, they haven't lost anything, right? If this becomes to be a nothing burger, as they say. Well, okay, so what? We got rid of probably some bad operators at a minimum, and nothing lost because they don't have anything at stake, right? We don't have large carriers with a big cadre of non-English speaking drivers. At least I assume we don't. And certainly not based outside of Laredo, Texas. Which really,
they might not know if they've got non-domiciled CDLs on their rolls.
That's another issue, and that is obviously something they they should be investigating.
Yeah, and there are some larger carriers that have a good number of them on their rolls. So maybe,
but there's enough other drivers out there that they should be able to replace those drivers, I think. So.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I think the concern really is not as much on that, is more about what the liability they could be under if these drivers get into a problem for them. Right.
That's
not the newspaper article they want to be in.
That's right.
Exactly. So, but we have to be honest that it's a fairly rarefied group that cares about liability, that truly cares about liability, unfortunately, right? If we would all like to think that everybody cares about liability and that's going to be a driver, but for the most part, a major accident is going to put you out of business. And if you're below a certain size, a major fatal is going to put you out of business anyway. So what difference does it make? Because you're going to have that you're either going to have that major fatal or you're not. And I think that, I'm not saying that's what they should think. I'm saying that's probably what they do think. And so, they don't necessarily see the ROI and all of that. Now, obviously, you get to a certain echelon. This is an extraordinarily big issue because we've seen, 8-digit, I guess we've seen 9-digit, verdicts. So
maybe if we step back out at a macro level. So the 2-part question. I'm picking up on Sean.
Nice. I like it.
Sean likes to bunch them together. So
you only get a few opportunities to speak.
I know, right? So on the first part of the question, kind of what are the major headwinds right now really impacting on the industry that you see? And on the flip side, kind of what on the optimistic, like what do you see on the optimistic side that could improve things going forward?
Sure. So, I mean, there is both a capacity headwind and a freight volume headwind. I mean, we've beaten the capacity one to death. I mean, we still have a large number of small operators. And I don't know that there's an easy fix unless it does turn out that the huge majority of them, or at least a plurality of them, are non-domiciled CDL holders. So let's put capacity aside. On the freight side, which is also where I think the biggest improvement could come, we just aren't getting any growth, and we probably should not be all that surprised that we aren't. I mean, we had this period of extraordinary, almost inconceivable consumer demand for goods, out of COVID, due to the combination of stimulus and the inability to do anything else with your money but buy stuff. Right? You couldn't go anywhere. And so there's a hangover from that. And that hangover also involved, building the industry's capacity to that peak level in order to meet that demand, and then not having that demand anymore. And we've been working through that, and we've talked already about why that didn't just correct. And I don't know that my answer to that is, satisfying to everybody. I can go through a full explanation on that, and a lot of people say, well, yeah, still I don't get it. Why? It's like, well, it's just a whole bunch of little things, and there's no silver bullet. But the real
Avery, is that across all freight segments?
Yeah, that's the real issue. I mean, that if we had a consistently growing, and it doesn't even have to be like the biggest freight market ever, but if we had a consistently growing freight segment, we would have been working through this. And that's the problem, is we just haven't. And, we could spend a whole lot of time as to why not, but, I talked about manufacturing. We just have been in a real manufacturing lull here ever since essentially 2022. And, we're not getting any traction. Consumer spending is okay, but as I said earlier, consumer spending, number one, doesn't drive as much freight as manufacturing. Number two, there's a lot of consumer spending that just isn't driving freight at all, even on goods. A lot, if you look at where consumers are spending their money, there's two big things moving consumer spending to the upside. One is electronics, including like software and digital downloads and things like that of course have, either no impact on freight or very little. And then the other side is pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals are going gangbusters. And while, if you're hauling pharmaceuticals, you're probably doing quite well on rate. And if that's your principal business, volume as well, but that isn't producing a whole lot of freight. So fundamentally, we have a soft freight market. That brings me to what's the upside. So as I look at things that could create an upside, the one that probably has the biggest potential impact is the budget reconciliation bill, or what's been called the One Big Beautiful Bill that was passed in July. And I say that because there was some significant tax relief. I wouldn't say it was the most robust tax relief we've ever seen, both for businesses and consumers. We saw increase in bonus depreciation and so on. And it's pretty early. And of course, we're not getting government statistics on any of this stuff right now because of the shutdown. But there certainly is the possibility that is going to produce an improvement. We certainly saw an improvement coming out of the 2017 tax bill. But that's actually an important point that unfortunately undercuts the optimism that I just said. And that is that I think a lot of people haven't paid attention, because obviously the Trump administration doesn't want them to, that the biggest piece of this bill that passed in July was simply continuing the tax cuts that were done in 2017. And the reason, and I bring that up because that is not very stimulative of new activity. It does keep us from collapsing. If those taxes had come back, that would have been bad news. I mean, and that's an understatement. But it doesn't produce a lot of additional activity. So that is probably the one. Another possibility, I think, is a recovery in the housing market. The last piece of data we got from the government on this score is one of the last things we got before the shutdown was this huge increase in new home sales in August. And we did get existing home sales data because that comes from the private sector for September. And that looks pretty good. And mortgage rates are starting to kind of come down. They're getting close to being below 6%. So that's another big benefit. That's a much more narrow benefit overall for the economy. But obviously, if you're in flatbed, residential construction is huge. And dry van. Home sales drives quite a bit of activity that I don't think everybody appreciates unless.
Yeah, because they've got to buy stuff to fill the house, right?
You're replacing flooring, you're replacing appliances, you're replacing furniture in a lot of cases. So that's another really big plus that could be out there. All of this, unfortunately, is speculative. I mean, our bigger concern is the weak job market, and it's probably good that we didn't get the BLS data for September yet, because we might be in a worse mood than we are now. But things were not looking good going into the government shutdown. And the only, the best private sector data we had on that wasn't looking good. So I tried to be optimistic, but I struggle to come up with exactly what's going to cause that optimism.
Well, one of the things I wanted to get your perspective on relating to that, and is, who knows what the real number is, but the Trump administration has been parading out all these major companies that are committed to all this commitment in manufacturing in the trillions of dollars, right? And so, I mean, all it is words right now. But to your point, if manufacturing is a big driver of trucking, right? To me, I think if some of those big projects start happening, that's got to be a good thing, right?
Yes, it is. Now, let's be clear. A lot of that is in the the computer, semiconductor. A lot of that. A lot of money for construction of those facilities. But guess what? We already did that. We had 2023. We spent a hell of a lot of money to build a lot of capacity for manufacturing that came out of what was known as the CHIPS Act or the Infrastructure Act that was passed in 2021. So the growth from this point is, I don't know, I got a big question mark on that. But yes, I mean, there is a lot of potential, and certainly, if I'm in flatbed, I probably are even more optimistic because. One thing is very clear is there is now a very strong preference for domestic steel and domestic, metals. So, if I'm hauling for some of those major manufacturers, it does look like things are brighter ahead. And in our own forecast, as we look at our forecast for the coming year, we kind of see dry van as being in sort of a holding pattern, not really growing. Now, dry van has outperformed the rest of the market for the last couple of years. So, maybe a little softness, maybe it's not justice, but at least they're not, in horrible shape. Refrigerated is just kind of what refrigerated always is. It's kind of following population growth, following job growth. So it's okay, not leaps and bounds. We do have a pretty strong forecast for this year, not so much next year, but this year on flatbed. Unfortunately, that is an annual forecast, and most of that activity has already happened. So the first quarter and second quarter were pretty good for flatbed, not so much this quarter and next quarter. But to your point, data center construction, right? Data centers, if you wanted to pick what is, it's like, what's the next bubble, right? What's the next bubble we're going to see? Well, my question is, how many data centers can we build, and how much electricity do we have? Data centers have sort of replaced electric trucks for obvious reasons, as sort of like, okay, is the power grid really going to support this? During the Biden administration, it was all, what was the thing? There's like, one city in Illinois would pretty much, you'd have to double their power generation in order to support like one truck terminal or something like that. But now it's data centers, and the reality is things don't keep going forever. There's going to be so I hate to undercut every attempt for me to be more optimistic, but I think the best thing I can say is we're kind of operating around the bottom in terms of where we can go in the economy absent a recession. So it does look like, we only have up from here. And we're not forecasting a recession. I mean, let's be clear on that. In fact, we have never during, starting in April of 2020 or March of 2020 even, we have never forecasted an economic recession during this whole time, and we haven't had one. We've had a couple of quarters with negative GDP growth, but that is strictly because imports count as a negative in the calculation of GDP. And so when we have these big quarters, like the first quarter of this year or the first quarter of 2022, for example, container imports are, like off the charts, that hurts GDP. So yes, yeah, that's why we have a separate measure. We have what we call GDP goods transport, which takes the same data source but filters it very differently. So you have a very different picture of what the freight market looked like. The freight market for Q1 was pretty good, was quite good, in fact. And then, but GDP was slightly negative. Conversely, second quarter wasn't all that great for goods transport, but it was quite a strong quarter for GDP. So imports tend to be very disruptive in how we look at data. So, and of course, like with everything else, the latest data we have on imports is from July. So that's because those tend to lag anyway. And then of course with the government shutdown. So we're operating largely in the dark, unfortunately, because of the shutdown. Now, that's boo-hoo. That's probably the least significant impact, right? But it is one that we focus on.
Yeah. Well, Avery, we're coming around the bend here. Really appreciate your time today. I'm going to ask one more question. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they'd like to say, but I do know that in January, FTR predicted gradual improvement through 2025. So my question is quite simply, were you right?
Good question. Well, you have to depend on us to tell you, because the way we operate, we're essentially creating the metric ourselves. But
yikes.
Yeah, well,
the hen house here, Avery.
Well, the problem is there's no fundamental reporting of volume the way there is in the rail industry, because the rail industry only has 6 players, right? So, yeah. I think the thing is we were expecting probably a more consistently soft market, and what we really got was a really strong first quarter and early second quarter, and then a pretty weak third quarter, and then I think the fourth quarter is going to be just kind of there. It's going to be kind of blah. Our current forecast right now has things being still sort of soft as we kind of digest the tariffs and adjust to them, because the tariffs become less of a deal once they stabilize. And of course, we haven't even talked about like the new tariff on trucks, for example. But eventually they'll just run out of things to tariff, and we'll have a stable environment. But we do have an expectation of a modest recovery starting, kind of like, early next year. When I say early, probably around the beginning of the second quarter, or certainly by the middle of the year. And for the reasons I talked about with the potential tax relief and all that very well could be stronger. There's also a lot of pent up demand probably that we haven't satisfied because of this longstanding weakness. So, I'm not pessimistic. I just want people to realize that we're not in the kind of cycle that I think people got sort of used to in 2017 and 18 and in 2020 and 2021. I think we're not looking at that kind of things are going to crash and then they're going to rebound. It's much more of I wouldn't say we crashed. We came down pretty pretty robustly, unfortunately, but we kind of held there. We've been in a really stable market for 3 years. And I think people aren't appreciating that because everybody talks about the freight recession, right? But the reality is that recession actually happened 3 years ago. We've been kind of in a very stable environment. We just haven't improved. And people call that a recession. Sure, if you're an actual trucking company, what difference does it make whether you're continuing to go down if things are down? But we look at it a little differently, which is that we're kind of bouncing around the bottom, and we do kind of only have up to go. We think, absent some sort of black swan event that we can't predict.
Finally, some optimism from Avery. He says, "There's only up to go. We made it." That's fantastic.
Yeah. There we go.
And that was my question. A year from now, are you happy? Are you sad? Are you indifferent? Where are we at a year from now?
Let's put it this way. A year from now, I do believe the trucking industry will be significantly stronger than it is now, which was not true. If we'd had this conversation in October of 2024, it would not have been true, I don't think, a year. And if we had the same conversation 2 years earlier, it wouldn't have been true. But I think it will be this time. When I say significant, let's keep this. We're not talking about 2021 here. We don't see 2021.
I love the conservative nature of you, Avery. But doing a Steve Keppler 2-part, what segment of trucking do you invest in right now? Is it final mile? Is it fuel? Is it flatbed? Is it where would you recommend?
I see the most upside right now probably being in flatbed and specialized, the specialized segments. I think that's where the most growth.
Writing a check right now. My 401k going in the flatbed.
None of those are publicly traded, of course. So
Bert, that's the only reason you're on this podcast today.
Insider trading. Sorry, SEC.
I don't think
didn't
any
mean
of them
that.
were publicly traded. Well, I guess some of them are because they have, but anyway.
Good. Well,
I'm going to Birmingham to talk to your friends over there and Alabama friends.
I like it. Good. Well, Steve, I don't know if you have anything else, or you want to take us home here?
I think, Avery, we could talk all day. I think this is really great. We appreciate you taking some time, and providing some insight to our
Absolutely.
listeners.
I've very much enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I hope
Thank you.
I
something correct.
Well, there's so much information that's out there today, and you don't know where to get your sources, right? So, and you've been a long-standing stalwart in our industry, and people trust your views. So we appreciate you coming in.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
100%. All right. Well, thank y'all.
Great. Thanks a lot. So long, guys.
All right.
Take care.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of True North Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the TTT Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know which topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comments section or send us an email to transportationnews@TrueNorthCompanies.com. Thanks and have a safe day.